Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship, valiant, and watched the stars through the massive viewport. He had been in space for 15 years now, and the sight still made him feel small. The ship hummed quietly around him as his crew worked at their stations. Everything seemed normal until the communications. Officer turned around with a strange look on her face. Lieutenant. Sophie Turner had been monitoring the long-range scanners when something appeared that should not have been possible. A signal was coming through on frequencies that humans had never used before. The message was clearly meant for them, and it was coming from deep space far beyond any human colony or outpost. Jake walked over to her station and looked at the data scrolling across her screen. The signal was strong and deliberate. Someone wanted to talk to humanity, and they had technology that was far more advanced than anything Earth had ever created. Sophie played the message, and the bridge fell silent as an alien voice filled the air. The translation came through perfectly somehow. The aliens had studied human languages well enough to communicate clearly. Ambassador Zixter of the Galactic Council was introducing himself and his people. He spoke with authority, and his tone left no room for argument. The Council had been watching humanity for 100 years since humans first achieved faster than light travel. They had seen everything humans had done and built in that time. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he listened. The ambassador explained that the Galactic Council was made up of 47 different alien species from across this region of space. They maintained peace and order among the stars. They had rules that everyone followed and systems that kept conflicts from turning into wars. Now that humanity had grown strong enough and spread far enough, it was time for them to join this system. But the way Zixter described it did not sound like an invitation. It sounded like a demand. Humanity needed to stop building warships immediately. They needed to hand over their weapons technology for review. They needed to accept that there were older and wiser species in the galaxy who knew better how things should be done. Humanity would have a place in the galactic community, but it would be a small place and a quiet one. The message was being broadcast to every human ship and colony and government building on Earth. Everyone was hearing this at the same time. Zixter gave humanity 72 hours to send representatives to the council station where the terms would be explained in detail. If humanity refused to send anyone or refused to accept the terms, then the council would take actions to protect galactic peace. Economic sanctions would come first. If those did not work, then humanity would be contained by force. Jake saved the message and immediately opened a channel to Earth. He needed to speak with Director Lisa Bennett, who ran the United Earth government from Geneva. It took several minutes for the connection to go through because every communication system on Earth was probably overloaded right now. When Lisa's face finally appeared on the screen, she looked tired and worried. She had already heard the message. Everyone had heard it. The entire planet was in chaos, with people demanding answers and leaders arguing about what to do next. Lisa told Jake to return to Earth immediately. They needed every senior military officer and scientist and diplomat in the same room to figure out how to respond. The Valiant turned around and began the 3-day journey back to Earth. Jake spent those days reading every piece of information they had about alien civilizations. It was not much. Humans had met a few other species during their expansion into space, but those meetings had been brief and distant. No one had mentioned anything about a galactic council or rules that everyone had to follow. When Jake finally arrived at the government complex in Geneva, he found the building surrounded by crowds and news crews. Inside was even more chaotic, with people rushing through hallways and voices raised in every conference room. He made his way to the main chamber where Lisa had gathered Earth's leadership. Admiral Connor Hayes was already there, along with General Pete Lawson, who commanded Earth's ground forces. Chief Science Officer Amanda Cole sat at the table with her tablet showing streams of data. Dr. Greg Palmer was there too. He was a xenopolitics expert who had spent his career studying what little humanity knew about alien cultures and governments. Lisa called the meeting to order and asked Greg to explain what they were dealing with. Greg stood up and activated a holographic display that showed a map of known space. He pointed to the region where the Council controlled things. It was vast and included hundreds of star systems. According to the limited information, they had every species in that region answered to the Council in some way. Greg explained that based on historical patterns, the Council always approached new species the same way. They waited until a species developed faster than light travel and began expanding beyond their home system. Then they made contact and offered membership in the Council. But membership came with conditions. The new species had to accept limits on their military and their territory. They had to follow Council laws even if those laws did not make sense for their culture. They had to give up some of their independence in exchange for protection and access to trade routes. Amanda spoke up and added that she had been analyzing the technology in the Council's message. Their communications systems were decades ahead of human technology. If their weapons and ships were equally advanced, then any war between humanity and the Council would be over quickly and humanity would lose badly. Admiral Hayes did not like hearing that, but he knew Amanda was probably right. He had 42 ships in the Earth defense fleet. They were good ships with well-trained crews, but they were designed to fight other human ships or handle pirates. Nobody knew what kind of weapons the Council had, or how many ships they could bring to a fight. General Lawson asked the obvious question. Did humanity have any choice in this matter? Could they simply refuse and hope the Council would leave them alone? Greg shook his head. According to everything he had studied, the Council did not accept refusal. Every species either joined under the Council's terms or was isolated and contained. Some species had tried to resist, and they were now restricted to their home systems with Council ships blockading them and preventing any expansion. Lisa looked around the table at the faces of people who had led humanity through wars and disasters and difficult decisions. She asked each of them what they thought humanity should do. The answers were mixed. Some argued for accepting the Council's terms because fighting was suicide. Others said that giving up freedom was worse than any military defeat. The debate went on for hours as people raised their voices and pounded the table and tried to find some path forward that did not end in disaster. Jake listened to all of it and felt his own thoughts churning. He had joined the space service because he believed in exploring and building and pushing humanity forward. The idea of stopping all of that because some aliens said they had to make his blood boil. But he also knew that getting everyone killed because of pride was not leadership. It was stupidity. As the sun set outside the windows, Lisa finally called for a vote. The vote did not happen that night because Lisa decided they needed more information first. She sent Greg Palmer and his team to analyze every piece of data they had about the Galactic Council and the species that belonged to it. She told Amanda Cole to gather her best scientists and figure out exactly how far behind human technology really was. Admiral Hayes got orders to prepare defensive plans in case talking did not work. Jake spent the next day reviewing reports from human colonies on the frontier. Many of them were scared and wanted Earth to accept whatever terms the Council offered. But some of the colony leaders sent very different messages. Captain Nicole Rodriguez commanded the defense forces at the colony on New Terra, and her message was blunt. She said that her people had not left Earth and traveled across the stars just to become servants to aliens they had never met. Nicole had been a soldier for 20 years and had fought in the resource wars back on Earth. She knew what happened when strong powers made demands of weaker ones. They always asked for a little at first and then a little more and then everything. She sent Jake detailed scans that her scout ships had gathered over the past 2 years while exploring beyond human space. The scans showed Council territories and the species that lived there. What Nicole had discovered was troubling. Every Council member species seemed to be locked into specific zones. They could not expand beyond certain boundaries. Their military forces were small and standardized. Even their commercial ships all looked similar, as if someone had decided what designs were acceptable and what were not. Nicole's scouts had also intercepted some Council communications. The translation was rough, but the meaning was clear enough. Several species were unhappy with council restrictions. They wanted to explore new territories or develop new technologies, but the council had rules against it. The rules were always justified as being necessary for peace and stability, but the result was stagnation. Jake forwarded all of Nicole's data to Lisa and then went to find Amanda Cole. He found her in a laboratory, surrounded by screens and models. She looked exhausted but excited. Her team had been running simulations non-stop since the council's message arrived. Amanda explained what I had learned. The council's technology was definitely more advanced than human technology in some areas. Their communications and sensors were far better, but humans had advantages too. Human ships were faster and more maneuverable. Human weapons were less sophisticated but more versatile. Most importantly, humans had developed their technology through constant warfare and competition. Every human nation and corporation had been trying to build better ships and weapons than their rivals. The pressure had created innovation. The council species had not fought major wars in thousands of years. Their technology had improved slowly through careful research and development, but there was no urgency and no competition pushing them to make breakthroughs. Amanda believed that in a real fight, human forces might do better than anyone expected. Jake asked her if she was saying humanity could win a war against the council. Amanda shook her head. She said humanity could make a war costly enough that the council might decide it was not worth the effort. But that assumed the council did not have weapons or ships they had not revealed yet. It was a huge gamble. The next morning, Lisa called another meeting. This time she included more people. Senator Kate Williams was there representing the political leadership. Henry Cooper came as well. He was a young diplomat who had been arguing for finding some middle ground with the council. Dr. Greg Palmer presented his findings first. Greg had spent 30 hours going through every record and analysis his team could produce. He explained that the Galactic Council had existed for 12,000 years. In all that time, every species that achieved faster-than-light travel had eventually joined the council. Some joined immediately. Others resisted for a while but eventually accepted the terms. A few species had tried to fight and they had been defeated and restricted to their home systems. The council system was built on control. New species were always brought in at the bottom of the hierarchy. They had to prove themselves over centuries before they gained any real influence. The species at the top of the council had been members for thousands of years, and they made all the important decisions. Newer members followed orders and contributed resources but had no real power. Henry Cooper stood up and said that maybe that was acceptable. Humanity could join at the bottom and work their way up over time. It was better than being isolated or destroyed. They could negotiate for the best terms possible and make the most of the situation. Senator Kate Williams cut him off. She had been reading the same reports as everyone else, and she had seen something that Henry was missing. The council's terms were never negotiated. Every species got the same offer. Surrender your weapons technology. Accept limits on your territory. Follow council laws. There was no flexibility and no compromise. Henry was talking about negotiation, but the council did not negotiate with new species. They dictated terms and you either accepted or faced consequences. General Lawson added that even if humanity wanted to accept the terms, they would be giving up any chance of defending themselves in the future. Once the council had all of humanity's weapons technology and humans had dismantled their military, there would be nothing stopping the council from imposing even harsher restrictions later. Humanity would be completely dependent on the council's goodwill. Admiral Hayes brought up another concern. The council had given humanity 72 hours to send negotiators. That deadline was clearly designed to pressure humanity into making a quick decision without thinking things through. It was a tactic used to keep people off balance. If the council really wanted peaceful integration, they would give humanity months or years to consider such a major decision. Lisa listened to everyone speak, and then she asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What if humanity simply said no? Not a refusal to talk, but a refusal to accept the council's authority at all. What if humanity told the Council that humans would continue exploring and expanding and developing as they saw fit? They would respect other species and their territories, but they would not accept limits imposed from outside. The room went quiet. Nobody had seriously considered that option because it seemed insane. Greg pointed out that no species had ever taken that position before. The Council would not know how to respond. They might see it as an act of war. Nicole Rodriguez's face appeared on one of the screens. She had been listening to the meeting from New Terra. She said that maybe the Council needed to see something they had never seen before. Maybe the problem was that every species approached the Council with fear and accepted whatever terms were offered. Maybe if one species stood up and refused to bow, the whole system would crack. Jake found himself nodding. He had been in enough fights to know that bullies usually backed down when someone stood up to them. But he also knew that sometimes standing up to a bully meant getting hit hard. The question was whether humanity could survive that hit. Amanda Cole spoke up again. She said her team could have new weapon systems ready within a month. If humanity was going to reject the Council's authority, they needed to be ready for war. General Lawson agreed and said his ground forces could mobilize quickly to defend key colonies. Lisa looked around the room one more time. She saw fear in some faces and determination in others. Then she made her decision. She would put it to a vote among Earth's leadership, but she would recommend that humanity reject the Council's ultimatum completely. They would not send negotiators. They would not accept restrictions. They would send a message explaining that humanity appreciated the Council's existence, but did not recognize their authority over human affairs. The vote was scheduled for the next day. Jake left the meeting knowing that humanity was about to do something that would change everything. The vote happened early the next morning, and it was closer than Jake had expected. 43% of Earth's leadership wanted to send negotiators and try to find some compromise. 57% voted to reject the Council's authority completely. Lisa Bennett stood before the cameras and announced the decision to the world. Humanity would not bow to demands from powers that had no right to make them. The reaction across Earth was mixed. Some people celebrated in the streets, saying humanity had finally shown the courage to stand on its own. Others protested and said the government was leading everyone to destruction. The stock markets crashed as investors panicked about a possible war. But Lisa did not back down. She told Admiral Hayes to prepare the fleet, and she told Jake to help record the message they would send to the Council. Jake worked with a video team to set up in the government building's main hall. They positioned cameras and lights while Lisa and Admiral Hayes reviewed the script they had written together. The message needed to be clear and firm but not aggressive. Humanity was not looking for a fight, but they would not surrender their freedom to avoid one when everything was ready. Lisa stood in front of the camera with Admiral Hayes on her right and Jake on her left. The camera operator counted down and then they were recording. Lisa spoke directly into the lens with a calm voice that did not waver. She thanked Ambassador Zixter and the Galactic Council for making contact with humanity. She acknowledged that the Council had maintained peace in their region of space for thousands of years, and that was admirable. Then her tone changed slightly. She explained that humanity had a different view of how free people should interact with each other. Humans believed that every species had the right to determine their own future without interference from outside powers. Humanity respected the Council's authority over species that had chosen to join it. But humanity had not chosen to join, and therefore did not recognize the Council's authority over human affairs. Lisa made it clear that humans would continue to explore space and establish colonies and develop new technologies. They would respect the territories and rights of other species. They would be willing to establish trade relationships and diplomatic channels with any species that wanted them. But humanity would not limit its own growth or surrender its defenses based on demands from the Council or anyone else. Admiral Hayes spoke next. He said that humanity hoped for peaceful coexistence with all species in the galaxy. But if the Council chose to enforce their demands through military action, then humanity would defend itself with every resource available. Human forces would not fire first, but they would not hesitate to respond to aggression. Jake said nothing during the recording, but his presence in uniform sent its own message. Humanity's military stood united behind this decision. When the recording ended, Lisa asked the communications team to broadcast it on every frequency the Council had used to contact them. Within minutes, the message was sent, and there was nothing to do but wait for the response. The Galactic Council received humanity's message during a session in their grand chamber on the station that served as their capital. Ambassador Zixther was presenting a routine report about trade disputes when the human transmission interrupted everything. The chamber's screens lit up with Lisa Bennett's face, and her words echoed through the space. The council members sat in shocked silence as the message played. Some of them had lived for hundreds of years, and none had ever heard anything like this. Species did not reject the council. Species did not declare themselves outside of council authority. The very idea was incomprehensible. When the message ended, Zixther stood frozen at his podium. Council leader Quindara finally broke the silence by calling for an immediate emergency session. The chamber erupted in voices as different species began arguing about what this meant and how to respond. Security Chief Ryan Blake demanded immediate military action. He said humanity had committed an act of defiance that could not be tolerated. If the Council allowed one species to ignore their authority, then others would follow. The entire system that had maintained peace for 12,000 years would collapse. He wanted to send the full Council fleet to Earth immediately and force humanity's surrender, but Quindara was more cautious. She had reviewed the intelligence reports about human military capabilities, and while humanity was clearly less advanced than the Council, they were not defenseless. More importantly, the psychological profile of humans suggested they would fight rather than surrender even against superior odds. A war with humanity might be won, but it would be costly. Admiral Tharkin of the Kryn Empire agreed with Ryan. He said that cost did not matter when the principle at stake was the Council's authority. If they showed weakness now, they would face challenges from other species later. The Council needed to demonstrate that defiance had consequences. He volunteered to lead a fleet to human space and establish a blockade. If humanity would not come to the Council station to negotiate, then the Council would bring the negotiations to them. Several other Council members supported this approach. The Vryn representative said that a blockade was not the same as an attack. It was a measured response that would pressure humanity without starting a war. The Selkoth delegate added that once humans saw the size and power of a Council fleet, they would realize resistance was futile and accept terms, but not everyone agreed. The Dolari ambassador stood and questioned whether the Council had the legal authority to enforce their system on a species that had never agreed to join. The Council's charter talked about maintaining peace among member species, but humanity was not a member. The Helios Collective representative quietly noted that several Council species were watching this situation closely and wondering. If the Council had become too controlling, Quindara called for a vote on sending a fleet to blockade human space. The motion passed with 78% support. Admiral Tharkin was authorized to assemble 200 warships from various Council member fleets. They would travel to Earth's solar system and establish a perimeter. No human ships would be allowed in or out until humanity agreed to send representatives to negotiate their integration into the Council. The fleet began gathering at a staging point 3 days away from Earth. Admiral Tharkin was confident that once humans saw his armada, they would realize their mistake. He had fought in the last major Council military action 60 years ago against a species that had violated territorial agreements. That war had lasted 3 days before the enemy surrendered. He expected this to be even quicker. Meanwhile, on Earth, the government was preparing for exactly this response. Lisa had expected the Council to send ships. She told Admiral Hayes to position the defense fleet between Earth and the most likely approach vector. Every human warship was recalled from patrol duties and colony defense assignments. 42 ships gathered near Mars and waited. Jake took command of a battle group consisting of 5 ships, including the Valiant. His orders were simple. Do not fire unless fired upon, but do not back down. If the Council wanted access to Earth, they would have to go. through the human fleet. Nicole Rodriguez brought her forces in from New Terra. She had 12 ships that were technically colonial defense vessels, but she had been upgrading them with new weapons that Amanda Cole's team had designed. The weapons had not been tested in real combat, but they were based on theories that Council species had apparently decided were too dangerous to pursue. Humans had no such restrictions. Chief Engineer Paul Mitchell was working on something else entirely. He had been developing a new type of faster-than-light communication relay that could transmit data instantly across vast distances. The Council had nothing like it because their member species shared technology slowly through bureaucratic channels. Paul's system would give human forces a coordination advantage if fighting started. Amanda Cole delivered the first batch of new weapon systems to the fleet. The weapons used focused particle beams that could punch through shields more effectively than traditional energy weapons. She also provided updated shield generators that could disperse incoming fire more efficiently. It was not enough to make human ships equal to Council vessels, but it closed the gap. Significantly, on the third day after humanity's message, the Council fleet entered the outer edge of the solar system. 200 warships in perfect formation moving toward Earth. Admiral Tharkin broadcast a message demanding that humanity stand down its forces and prepare to receive Council negotiators. He gave them 12 hours to comply. Admiral Hayes did not respond with words. He ordered the human fleet to move forward and take up defensive positions directly in the path of the Council Armada. 42 human ships facing 200 Council vessels. The odds were terrible, but no one in the human fleet suggested retreating. Jake stood on the bridge of the Valiant and watched the enemy fleet approaching on his screens. His crew was silent and tense. Everyone knew this could be the last day of their lives, but everyone also knew they were making history. For the first time in 12,000 years, someone was standing up to the Galactic Council and refusing to bow. The two fleets faced each other across empty space, and the galaxy held its breath. The standoff lasted for 6 days, and during that time nobody slept well on either side. Admiral Tharkin kept his fleet in formation just outside weapons range, while Admiral Hayes maintained his defensive position. Both commanders knew that the first shot fired would start a war that neither side truly wanted, but both were prepared to fight. Jake spent those days running drills with his battle group and studying the Council fleet's movements. The enemy ships were impressive and clearly built by civilizations that had mastered space travel long before humans left Earth. But Jake noticed something interesting. The Council ships moved in rigid formations and followed predictable patterns. They were disciplined but not creative. It was like watching a machine execute a program rather than living beings. Adapting to a situation, Sophie Turner was monitoring all communications from the Council fleet, and she discovered something that changed everything. The different alien species in that fleet were talking to each other, but not always in friendly ways. The Kryn ships that made up the core of the fleet were giving orders to ships from other species. Some of those species were following orders reluctantly, and their internal communications showed frustration and resentment. Sophie brought her findings to Jake, who immediately contacted Admiral Hayes. If the Council fleet was not as unified as it appeared, then there might be ways to exploit those divisions. Hayes agreed and ordered his intelligence officers to map out which species seemed most unhappy with the current situation. Meanwhile, on Earth, Lisa Bennett was dealing with her own challenges. The blockade was already affecting the economy as trade ships could not leave or enter the solar system. Food supplies were fine because Earth produced enough to feed its population, but luxury goods and advanced materials from the colonies were cut off. Some political leaders were demanding that Lisa reconsider and send negotiators to the Council. Senator Kate Williams helped Lisa hold the government together by reminding everyone what was at stake. If humanity gave in now after making such a bold stand, they would lose all credibility. The Council would impose even harsher terms to punish humanity for its defiance. The only path forward was to hold firm and hope the Council would eventually realize that humans could not be bullied into submission. Ambassador Julia Stevens had been working quietly on another approach. She had used back channels to make contact with the Dalari delegation on the council station. The Dalari were one of the species that had questioned whether the council had the right to force humanity into membership. Julia spent hours in secret communications with a Dalari diplomat named Kervin, explaining humanity's position and asking if the Dalari might support reforms to the council system. Kervin was sympathetic but cautious. The Dalari had been council members for 3,000 years and had often disagreed with council policies. But openly defying the council was dangerous. Still, Kervin promised to bring humanity's arguments to the Dalari leadership and see if there was any willingness to challenge the status quo. On the 7th day of the standoff, something unexpected happened. A single ship from the council fleet broke formation and approached the human lines. It was a small vessel from the Helios Collective, and it was broadcasting a request to speak with human commanders. Admiral Hayes was suspicious, but agreed to allow the ship to approach under a temporary truce. The Helios captain explained that her people had been watching humanity's actions with great interest. The Helios Collective had joined the council 400 years ago and had regretted it ever since. They were restricted in their exploration, and their technology development and their culture had stagnated under council rules. She wanted to know if humans were serious about maintaining their independence, or if this was just posturing before accepting terms. Admiral Hayes told her the truth. Humanity would rather fight and lose than surrender their freedom. The Helios captain seemed to believe him. She said that her ship would return to the council fleet, but she would share what she had learned with her government. Then she added something that sent chills down Jake's spine. Admiral Tharkin had orders to attack if humanity did not surrender within 10 days of the original deadline. That deadline was tomorrow. The Helios ship returned to the council fleet, and Admiral Hayes immediately contacted all human forces. They had less than 24 hours before the shooting would start. He ordered his ships to prepare for combat, and he sent a message to Earth warning that the situation was about to turn violent. Lisa told him to do whatever was necessary to protect humanity, but to avoid firing first if at all possible. Jake gathered his crew and explained what was coming. Some of them looked scared and others looked eager, but everyone understood their duty. The Valiant and the other ships in Jake's battle group moved into their final defensive positions. Nicole Rodriguez positioned her colonial ships on the flanks where they could use their speed to harass enemy vessels. Amanda Cole transmitted the final updates to the new weapon systems and wished everyone luck. The deadline arrived, and Admiral Tharkin sent one last message to the human fleet. He demanded immediate surrender and threatened total destruction if humans continued to resist. Admiral Hayes responded with a simple message. Humanity would defend itself against any aggression but remained open to peaceful dialogue between equals. The Council could withdraw their fleet and establish normal diplomatic relations, or they could attack and face consequences they had not anticipated. Tharkin apparently took that response as a final refusal. He ordered his fleet to advance and establish a closer blockade around Earth. The Council ships began moving forward in their perfect formations. Admiral Hayes waited until they crossed into the inner solar system, and then he gave his own orders. The human fleet would withdraw toward Mars and draw the Council ships deeper into human space. The Council fleet pursued, expecting the humans to be running in fear. But Jake knew the real plan. Admiral Hayes was pulling them into a carefully prepared trap. Over the past week, human engineers had deployed hundreds of automated defense platforms in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. The platforms were small and hard to detect, and they were armed with the new particle beam weapons Amanda had designed. Additionally, the belt itself had been seeded with proximity mines that would activate when Council ships passed nearby. The Council fleet followed the human ships into the belt, and that was when everything changed. The defense platforms activated and opened fire from dozens of angles simultaneously. The mines began detonating near Council ships, disrupting their shields and damaging their hulls. The perfect formations fell apart as individual ships took evasive action. Admiral Hayes ordered the human fleet to turn and engage. 42 human ships charged back toward 200 Council vessels that were now scattered and confused. Jake felt his heart pounding as the Valiant accelerated into weapons range. His crew opened fire with everything they had, and he watched as their particle beams carved through a Kryn destroyer's shields. The battle turned into chaos. Council ships were more powerful individually, but they had not fought a real battle in decades. Human ships were smaller and weaker, but their crews had trained constantly for exactly this kind of fight. Nicole Rodriguez led her colonial ships in hit-and-run attacks that confused enemy sensors and divided their attention. The automated platforms kept firing from concealed positions, making it impossible for the Council fleet to know where the next attack would come from. One of the Council ships targeted the Valiant and scored a direct hit that knocked out their port shield generators. Alarms blared across the bridge, and Sophie reported multiple hull breaches. But Jake kept his ship in the fight, and his gunners managed to disable the enemy vessel's engines, leaving it drifting helplessly. The battle raged for 3 hours, and the human fleet took heavy losses. 12 ships were destroyed, and another 8 were too damaged to continue fighting. But the Council fleet suffered far worse. 37 ships were destroyed, and 70 more were damaged. Admiral Tharkin finally ordered a retreat when he realized his fleet was being torn apart by an enemy he had vastly underestimated. The Council ships withdrew from the solar system in disorder, and the remaining human vessels were too damaged to pursue. Admiral Hayes broadcast a ceasefire order, and the shooting stopped. Jake looked around his bridge at his exhausted crew and damaged ship. They had survived, and more importantly, they had proven that humanity could not be easily defeated. The Council fleet regrouped at their staging point, and Admiral Tharkin sent an emergency message to the Council leadership. His report was simple and shocking. Humanity had won the battle. The news of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. Species that had been Council members for thousands of years heard that a newly contacted civilization had defeated a Council fleet and refused to submit to Council authority. The reaction was not what the Council leadership had anticipated. On the Council station, Quindara faced the worst crisis of her long career. Council members were demanding explanations, and some were questioning whether the Council's approach to new species had been wrong all along. The Dolari formally requested an emergency session to discuss reforms to how the Council dealt with independent species. The Helios Collective went even further and announced they were suspending their military contributions to Council operations until a full review was conducted. Security Chief Ryan Blake wanted to send another fleet immediately and crush humanity before this rebellion spread any further. But Admiral Tharkin refused to lead another attack. He told the Council that humanity had weapons and tactics that Council forces were not prepared to counter. Any new attack would need to be much larger and would certainly result in thousands of casualties. He also noted that some of the species in his fleet had performed poorly during the battle because they had no real loyalty to the Council cause. Quindara realized that forcing another confrontation might fracture the Council itself. If species started questioning why they were fighting to force humanity into a system that restricted their own freedoms, then the entire Council structure could collapse. She needed a different approach, but the problem was that the Council had no precedent for dealing with a species that simply refused to acknowledge their authority. Ambassador Julia Stevens saw an opportunity in the chaos. She contacted Kervin again and proposed something radical. What if humanity and the Council established a new type of relationship based on mutual respect rather than submission? Humans would recognize the Council's authority over its member species and would respect Council territories. In exchange, the Council would recognize humanity as an independent sovereign power with the right to expand and develop without Council interference. Kervin brought the proposal to the Dolari leadership, and they saw potential in it. The Dolari had wanted to reform the Council for centuries, but had never found the leverage to force change. Now, with humanity demonstrating that the Council could be resisted and other species watching to see what would happen next, the moment had arrived. The Dolari announced they would support negotiations with humanity on the basis of equality rather than submission. The announcement shocked the Council. The Vryn representative accused the Dalari of betraying 12,000 years of tradition. The Kryn delegates threatened to use military force against any species that broke from council unity. But Quindara saw the writing on the wall. If she tried to hold the old system together by force, she would trigger a civil war that would destroy everything the council had built. On Earth, Lisa Bennett received a message directly from Quindara requesting formal negotiations. The message was carefully worded to avoid any suggestion that humanity was surrendering or submitting. Instead, it spoke of two sovereign powers seeking to establish productive relations. Lisa consulted with Admiral Hayes and Senator Kate Williams, and they agreed this was worth pursuing. Jake was given a new assignment. He would command the escort fleet that would take Lisa and her diplomatic team to a neutral location for negotiations. The meeting would not happen on the council station because that would imply humanity was coming as a subordinate. Instead, both sides agreed to meet on a space station in unclaimed territory halfway between human and council space. The journey took 5 days, and Jake used that time to repair the Valiant and integrate the lessons learned from the battle. His crew worked around the clock to fix damaged systems and install improved weapons. When they arrived at the neutral station, they found council ships already there, but this time the atmosphere was different. There were no demands or ultimatums. Both sides were genuinely trying to find a way forward. Lisa met with Quindara in a conference room that had been carefully designed to show neither side as superior. They sat at a round table with their advisors behind them. Kervin represented the Dalari and several other council species, sent observers to watch these historic negotiations. The talks lasted for 3 weeks, and there were many difficult moments. The council wanted guarantees that humanity would not attack council territories or interfere with member species. Lisa agreed to those terms, but demanded equal guarantees that the council would not interfere with human expansion into unclaimed space. The council wanted access to human military technology to understand what had made the battle so costly for them. Lisa refused to share weapons technology, but offered to share defensive systems and medical advances. The hardest issue was what to call this new relationship. The council could not officially recognize a species as completely independent, because it would undermine their authority over existing members. But humanity would not accept any title or status that implied subordination. Finally, they found a compromise. Humanity would be recognized as an allied sovereign power, not a member of the council, but not an enemy either. A separate category that had never existed before. The agreement included provisions for trade and diplomatic exchange. Human ships would have access to council space lanes for commercial purposes. Council species could establish embassies on Earth and human colonies. Most importantly, both sides agreed that their previous conflict would not lead to ongoing hostility. They would start fresh and build a relationship based on mutual benefit rather than dominance. When Lisa returned to Earth, she was greeted as a hero. The agreement was not perfect, and some people complained that humanity had given up too much, while others said humanity should have demanded more. But most people recognized that humanity had achieved something remarkable. They had faced down the most powerful alliance in the galaxy and forced it to recognize them as equals. Jake attended the ceremony where Lisa presented the agreement to Earth's leadership. He stood in his dress uniform with medals he had earned during the battle and listened as she explained what they had won. Humanity would continue to explore and expand and develop without limits imposed from outside. Human colonies would grow and human technology would advance. Future generations would reach for the stars knowing they were free to shape their own destiny. Admiral Hayes gave a speech honoring the crew members who had died during the battle. 23 ships had been lost and over 4,000 people had not come home. Their sacrifice had bought humanity's freedom, and they would never be forgotten. Memorials were established on Earth and Mars and at every human colony. The date of the battle became a holiday called Independence Day, when people would remember the price of freedom. Nicole Rodriguez was promoted to admiral and given command of the frontier fleet. Her aggressive tactics and innovative thinking had been crucial during the battle, and now she would help defend the expanding edge of human space. Amanda Cole received funding to continue developing new technologies without restriction. She assembled teams of scientists who were excited to push boundaries that the Council had declared off limits, but the most significant changes happened across Council space. The Dalari formally withdrew from full Council membership and established themselves as an allied sovereign power like humanity. 3 other species announced they were considering similar moves. Quindar tried to hold the Council together by proposing reforms that gave member species more autonomy and freedom to develop their own policies. The Council would never be the same. For 12,000 years, it had operated on the principle that peace required control and unity required submission. Humanity had shattered that principle and proven that sovereign powers could coexist without one dominating the others. Some Council species welcomed the change while others resisted, but the momentum was unstoppable. Jake returned to duty commanding the Valiant on exploration missions into unclaimed territories. He led his ship and crew to discover new worlds and make first contact with species that had never heard of either humanity or the Council. Each time he met a new civilization, he remembered what humanity had fought for: the right to chart their own course and make their own choices and face the future on their own terms. On a colony world called New Hope, a young girl named Emma stood with her parents watching ships arrive with supplies and settlers. She asked her father why the ships had weapons and scars from battle. He knelt down beside her and explained that sometimes people had to fight for their freedom. He told her about the day humanity stood alone against impossible odds and refused to bow. He said that because of what those crews had done, Emma would grow up in a galaxy where humans walked as equals with every other species. Emma looked up at the stars and imagined what it would be like to travel among them. She did not know that 30 years later she would command her own ship and negotiate the alliance that would bring 15 independent species together in a new confederation built on the principles humanity had defended. She did not know that the Council would eventually dissolve and reform as a voluntary association of equals. She only knew that the stars were waiting and nothing would stop humanity from reaching them. Lisa Bennett retired after serving 10 more years as director of the United Earth government. In her final speech, she reflected on the decision humanity had made to reject the Council's ultimatum. She said that freedom was always worth the risk and that people who surrendered their liberty for security usually ended up with neither. She reminded everyone that the galaxy was vast and full of wonders and challenges. Humanity's greatest adventure was just beginning. Jake Morrison eventually became an admiral himself and trained the next generation of officers. He taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face fear for something greater than yourself. He told them about standing on the bridge of the Valiant watching a fleet of 200 enemy ships approach and knowing the odds were terrible but refusing to back down. He said that was the moment he understood what it meant to be human. The galaxy would never forget the species that said no when everyone expected them to submit. Humanity had earned their place among the stars not through conquest or dominance, but through the simple courage to stand up and say they were free and would remain free no matter the cost. That example inspired others and changed the course of galactic history. And it all began with a message that stunned the Galactic Council by rejecting negotiation and asserting the eternal human right to self-determination.